Welcome to the Gateway House weekly webcast. And today we have an interesting topic, which is the corona diplomacy. And we are seeing that how the coronavirus pandemic, the outbreak has, sort of changed the way we see the world. And we're also seeing a different or maybe a new kind of diplomatic ties and relationship is being built up here. So we have two distinguished panelists with us. We have Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia. He's a veteran diplomat, as you all are aware, and he's now the distinguished fellow with the Gateway House. And we also have Mr. David Rasquinha. He's the helm of affairs. He's the managing director of the Exim Bank. So to start with you, Ambassador Bhatia, if you can tell us a little bit, in this kind of a pandemic crisis, we are talking about lockdown, economic impact, some kind of positivity maybe is emerging or may not be, in your views, a new diplomacy that's coming up and what the kind of shape it will take going forward, if you can enlighten us with your views, sir. Ambassador, I think you have to unmute your mic, please. Yes, I think now you
Is that okay? Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes, yes.
And you can see me also?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for your first question to me. It's a great pleasure to be here. I think I would like to begin by saying that probably we at Gateway House can claim a bit of IPR on the word India's corona-diplomacy. You will not see in the hyphen, but that is because the title of that presentation is here. Essentially, corona diplomacy, just to define it very clearly, is the subset of India's war on COVID-19. It's a multi-pronged war, and diplomacy is playing a very significant role in this strategy. Now, of course, we have to be very clear that if our score had not been as reassuring and as good as it is today, it would have been difficult to talk about our diplomatic contribution in a very positive manner. Even though, even one death is one death too many, but looking at the global scene, India's score today is still something that we need to note. We know that the total caseload for India is 30,000 and the total deaths is about 1,000. Compared to the larger global figures, this is something by way of an achievement. And it is in this context, what diplomacy has been trying to do is really to secure, in my view, three fundamental goals. First of all, the objective is to try to save lives and also to make sure that health security of the people of India is ensured, and whatever is required to be done for this purpose seems to be getting done across the board. The second goal obviously is to look at the adverse impact of COVID-19 on economy of India, saving livelihoods, trying to stabilize the disruptions that are being caused, and therefore the economic dimension is very significant. And the third goal is to keep trying to help the neighbors and friends of India. And therefore I would say that in character, India's diplomacy on this particular reel is not merely nationalist, but it is internationalist in character. And very quickly, if you allow me, I want to speak also about the tools of diplomacy. And here we notice that there are at least three of them. First, the imaginative use of the video conference. Second, a very vigorous and optimal use of phone outreach. And the third is the ability to arrange massive evacuations. And we will get into that later if need be. But we can be very clear that here in this very context, India has also resorted to pharmacy exports, pharma products exports And today, I think the latest figures indicate that India has sent medicines in the last few weeks to 108 countries. So this label of India as the pharmacy of the world is proving to be truly true. And this is in the context where Indian companies are doing a lot of good work across the world. And therefore, I think we can be sure that India's corona diplomacy has a very practical orientation.
Sure, that is very interesting to hear from you, Ambassador Bhatia. And yes, I think if anything positive that we can see that is coming out of this pandemic is the diplomacy. And yes, we've seen how Prime Minister Modi has taken initiatives on, be it SARC or G20 on the virtual conferencing. So, and also the point that you've made on the economic dimension, saving livelihoods and, helping friends and neighbors. So on that note, I would really like to ask Mr. Rasquinha, since, Exim Bank has been at the forefront of economic measures and economic diplomacy, so to say, when it comes to project exports, etc. How do you think India has been helping out during this pandemic? And also, as Ambassador said, going forward, where do you see the road lies? So if you can enlighten us. And before that, if I can request viewers to put yourself on mute, then it will be better for all of us for resolution. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Nayanima. Let me start with what India is doing. I think Ambassador Bhatia has already covered some of it. If you see, one of the key areas where India is considered to be the global pharmacy is our capability when it comes to generic medication, specifically drugs like hydroxychloroquine sulfate or HCQS, which has become pretty much in demand in many countries around the world. Now, I think the jury is still out as to the efficacy of hydroxychloroquine, but certainly many countries have made requests to us. President Trump of the United States, of course, was well known for his request, but I must say President Bolsonaro of Brazil made a highly imaginative and very culturally appropriate request. He did, in fact, compare Lord Hanuman flying to bring the Sanjeevani herb and actually bringing the entire Govardhan mountain with him, and therefore requested India to help out with hydroxychloroquine to Brazil. I thought that was a brilliant use of diplomacy and invoking Indian culture. But to come to some numbers, India has shipped hydroxychloroquine to almost 55 countries around the world. This is in the United States, Europe, Africa, Latin America. Now, some of this, of course, is commercial sales, but a lot of it is complementary drugs being given as a gift from India to countries who are not in the best economic conditions, and of course to those who can afford
especially to our neighbors. Yeah. Yes.
But even, I'm sorry to...
I'm saying especially to our neighbors, it has gone as a humanitarian aid.
Exactly, exactly. In fact, we have given it as a gift to as many as 31 countries. So out of the 55, 31 countries were by way of gift, and the balance 24 were as exports. And not only that, we've been using Indian aircraft. That is, the Air India has stepped up to the plate tremendously. The Indian Air Force also has been helping out in the transport of drug consignments. For that matter, we've even sent Indian doctors to countries like Nepal, Myanmar, Maldives, even Kuwait, to help them combat the spread of COVID. So there have been a lot of indications being done by economic diplomacy, but then it's too early to talk further in terms of what project exports, because obviously right now you cannot really have any travel being undertaken by people. There cannot be work on project sites. So you're really restricted to where you are when the COVID epidemic broke out. So where do we go from here? And this is the big worry, because if you look at the impact of COVID, and you can look at it as a spectrum of impact, it is primarily a health issue. And all of us have to remember that it is primarily people falling sick, people falling very sick, and some people unfortunately dying as well. Ambassador Bhatia very rightly pointed out that in India, the impact has been significantly less. I mean, 1,000 deaths is a lot. 1,000 deaths is 1,000 deaths, but it is still a fraction of what is happening, let us say, in the United States, or what has happened in various parts of Western Europe. If you look at Africa, for example, the entire African continent, whose population is more or less on par with that of India, the total number of deaths are estimated to be around 21,000. Now, one may wonder about the accuracy of statistics because it is very difficult to identify somebody who has succumbed from COVID as compared to another comorbidity. But these are approximate numbers. So at its heart, it is a health tragedy, a life tragedy. But going forward is where the challenge really comes up for project exports that you mentioned, Nayanima. Fundamentally, you're going to see economies which are severely impacted because much of the developing world, and our project exports are primarily to the developing world, much of the developing world is a commodity exporter. You've seen a crash in commodity prices, oil prices. I don't need to say, you actually had a futures contract for May delivery going into negative on West Texas Intermediate, but even other petroleum prices are prevailing at an all-time low. Coal prices are low, other raw material prices are low. Well, naturally, because the supply is far greater than the demand. So where are these countries going to get the revenues which they would need to pay for imports, not just of medication, but also for that matter of projects or development projects? Tourism is going to be impacted. You're not going to have people traveling as freely or as willingly as they were earlier. So this is going to impact government revenues in the developing world, and therefore their ability to pay at precisely the time when they need to invest in development projects.
Well, that's also an interesting aspect. I don't think many, this has been really talked about, how and from where will the money come from for these projects, and going forward, how India would like to, conduct its diplomacy on that. Coming next again to Ambassador Bhatia, on the COVID diplomacy again, and also taking a cue what Mr. Rasquinha just said, plurilaterally and multilaterally, where do you think things will stand, especially giving a focus on what role India should be playing going forward once the pandemic sort of stabilizes?
Thank you very much. I'll try to give you a brief answer in order to help you with the clock. On the multilateral and the plurilateral side, I think there is a whole long Ramayana or Mahabharata that is unfolding at the global level. What we can clearly see is that multilateralism is in a bit of a crisis. It was there before the corona crisis broke out, and it certainly has been accentuated by this catastrophe. But nevertheless, UN did what it could. The UN Security Council, discussed the matter. The UN General Assembly adopted 2 resolutions, and WHO, which is the principal UN body, which has been struggling and addressing this question to the best of its capabilities. And it is in that context, there are these polemics whether we should do something better with WHO. India has taken a very wise middle path position by saying that we must continue to support and empower WHO, and at the same time, when the time comes, we should look for doing reform of WHO. Secondly, at the level of the G20, which is the premier global forum in the world today, India took a special initiative to make sure that the virtual summit took place. It took certain decisions. They were not earth-shaking decisions, but it is important that since the virtual summit, there's been a set of 4 ministerial meetings of the G20 countries, and things are beginning to take some shape in order to translate the G20 action plan. And at the third level, Nayanima, I think it's also reassuring to note that BRICS has also been put into operation. It has been activated on 28th, as we all know. The BRICS foreign ministers met, and they have had very useful discussion on various aspects of health cooperation and economic cooperation. So overall, it looks like our diplomatic efforts being done quietly are showing some positive results.
That's interesting, Ambassador Bhatia, as always. Yes, there have been a lot of talks at the UN and talks of WHO reform. But if I can come back to Mr. Rasquinha again, we've discussed what can happen plurilaterally and multilaterally. But if I can ask you, the question that is there in everyone's mind today is the economic fallout of this pandemic. Yes, Ambassador Bhatia did talk about livelihoods. You've spoken about how money can be spent and revenues can be earned out of project exports. But in a larger format, how do you see the fallout happening, at least as far as diplomacy is concerned?
Probably one of the first impacts has already been considered by the G20 countries. There is an anticipation that some amount of debt relief might have to be considered. The G20 communique had certain recommendations to the member countries. It was not a mandatory issue, it was a recommendation that countries should sympathetically consider various aspects of debt relief being requested by the heavily indebted countries. And that is perhaps one of the biggest issues, because most of the bilateral support from various countries is by way of development projects, which ultimately come out of the individual national budgets. And since national budgets are going to be under pressure from the revenue side as well as the expenditure side, this becomes something for all of us to think about. Now, in normal times, such debt relief is normally considered at the Paris Club on a multilateral basis. I'm not sure whether the Paris Club is really in a position to look at this kind of an aspect at the present moment, not just from the viewpoint of logistics of movement, but the number of countries involved is now so large that I'm not entirely sure the Paris Club is up to the task. Bear in mind that the largest such creditor today would be China. And there has been a lot of information in the media about the debts owed by various countries to China, some of which is on the official record, not all of it is on the official record. So this is perhaps something which needs to be looked at, because individual countries will necessarily be a bit wary of providing debt relief unless there is a corresponding move by all creditors. The freeloader problem is always a worry in economics, and this is something which I think would affect here.
Sure. And before I throw the audience, I mean, in the sense, throw the thing questions for questions, if I can ask both of you, Ambassador Bhatia and Mr. Rasquinha, very quickly, before I come back to the audience, and many questions are coming in. What is it that you think, how is it going to impact the African countries? Just 2 minutes each, and then
yes.
I'll have the audience in.
Thank you, Nayanima. I'll use my first minute to highlight one more positive dimension of corona diplomacy, and this is India's brave attempts, which are proving successful, to try to put SARC into operation in order to handle this crisis. I think this was a remarkably bold attempt to put focus on an instrument which had become somewhat blunted in the recent years, but now it is working in new conditions, and SARC has already operated its emergency fund. It has started its whole exchange of medicines, equipment, personnel, technical information at the level of the various member states. And it has now started off a new portal. So all this is very positive, but to focus on beyond what we have spoken, I think I would like very much to say that there are some areas where the government needs to focus a little bit more sharply. The African Union is one. I think we need to connect with them better, because they are a major player in Africa. I think we also need to connect better with ASEAN, because they might be feeling a bit neglected. We need to hold a ministerial virtual conference with them. And certainly, finally, we need also to put some vigor into BIMSTEC, which has been the favorite organization of the government for the last 4 or 5 years.
Right. And Mr. Rasquinha, your views, please, before I start taking the questions.
Sure. You spoke specifically of Africa. So I would like to, bring back an idea which had been under consideration earlier but did not get some traction. About 4 or 5 years ago, we had proposed to the government of India, the Ministry of External Affairs particularly, a kind of a macro level project. We'd even suggested a name. It could be called the Gandhi Mandela Initiative, so that it would link India and Africa. But what we had in mind is, India is known for its pharmaceutical industry and for its healthcare. We have a large number of patients from African countries and from other parts of the developing world who come to India on a medical tourism kind of a system in order to avail of procedures like cardiac or joint replacement in India, which are of world class and are far more economical than performed elsewhere. Now, what we had suggested is, why don't we set up a kind of a quadrilateral of tertiary hospitals? If we pick the African continent to start with, let's start with 4 countries in different parts, and the choice of countries, the Ministry of External Affairs is the best party to decide. But if we could identify these countries, set up a tertiary care hospital by Indian companies, have attached to it a medical college and a nursing college, because you can't have a hospital with just a shell in it. Staff it with Indian staff, and have an Indian company do an operations and maintenance contract for, let's say, 5 years or 8 years or 10 years. So that that hospital is not just a building which is handed over, but is a living facility which would then take care of many of the needs of the African continent. And only those medical tourism would come to India, which are of highly complex processes, which you need not necessarily replicate all over. This is an idea I feel is still relevant.
Sure.
If we do this, we would get a tremendous amount of goodwill, and these are our strengths: healthcare, hospitals, doctors and nurses. This is something which could really work well, but we have to get the private sector involved in doing this. I think this could really be a winner going forward.